Edgar, would you mind just doing the standard thing and briefly sketching the rough outline of the film for me?
The film is about 5 friends. When they were teenagers, Simon Pegg's character was the coolest cat of the group. Cut to over 20 years later, and that is not the case. The others have all grown up without him. They've got wives and kids, successful careers, and Simon's character is still desperately clinging on to his teens. So he emotionally blackmails them to all go back to their hometown and try and complete this wild night of drinking that they didn't do when they were younger. And then, as a cautionary tale in the be careful what you wish for way, they get a completely different wild night.
I can cross off my cautionary tale question as
There
well.
you
Thanks, Edgar. And what inspired the idea? Perhaps you could touch on your early script and also the British sci-fi, etc.
So it was inspired by a number of things. When I was a teenager, I attempted a pub crawl in my hometown, which had 15 pubs, and I got through about 6 of them. So I failed pretty spectacularly and got incredibly drunk. And later I wrote a script about it, about teenagers on a pub crawl. And I never did anything with it, but then later I started to think that actually it might be more kind of dramatic and pathetic and comedic if it was about older guys trying to recapture their teenage years. So really the film sort of became something that was like, probably the teenage version was like a sort of a glorification of that. And then this version is really about, the villain of the piece is really nostalgia, about how maybe you shouldn't look backwards, you know, that you shouldn't go back, you can never go home again. And that's where the sci-fi element comes in, because I grew up in a small town, I moved to the city, and when I went back it was always kind of like sort of slowly, incrementally feeling different on every visit, to the point where you feel, pun intended, alienated in your hometown. So so that was the idea, that's where that came from, in terms of the idea of showing that the changes in the town were not just the passage of time, there was something more sinister and more insidious at work.
And how do the writings and television adaptations of the work of John Wyndham and other British sci-fi writers, how do they influence the film?
When I was growing up, there were a lot of movies and TV shows that were either direct adaptations or inspired by the works of like John Wyndham, who wrote The Midwich Cuckoos, aka Village of the Damned, Day of the Triffids, The Kraken Awakes, Chucky. Then there's like Nigel Neal, who created Quatermass, which like had TV adaptations and film adaptations. And then I guess in terms of American films, it'd be things like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Stepford Wives. I think because I came from a small town, like those movies with a slightly more narrow focus used to kind of terrify me more in a way, as more kind of like more sort of taken with something like Stepford than I would be about a monster attacking London, you know. So I think that's, you know, that's where that comes from, is that was a big part of my upbringing, and that, you know, also kind of like the influence is felt in TV, whether it's like Doctor Who or the original Avengers or The Prisoner. It was that feeling of like the sort of the claustrophobia and oppressiveness of small British towns, and I grew up in one.
Yes, as did I. It's unfortunate. And can you briefly outline, in terms of not just cast members and the jokes, but in terms of theme, how World's End fits in with Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, please, Nick?
Well, there are some superficial similarities between the other two films in that they have the same cast in places. They all have ice cream in them. They all have a scene where somebody tries to jump a fence. But then overall, how we try to make it a thematic trilogy is it's all about friendship. It's all about kind of growing up and taking responsibility. And, you know, there's this strain of discussing perpetual adolescence. And in this movie, we wanted to make that a very final statement with one character who just wants to be young again. He's actually sort of given up on going forward. All he wants to do is go backwards.
And last one on this section, how much, if at all, does the pub feature in your own life nowadays, Edgar?
I still like to have a drink, although I'll be completely honest and say that I'm more of a wine drinker these days. And so, like, I do have the occasional lager, but certainly not the same as when I was in my, like, teens and 20s. I think the sort of those days of imbibing huge volumes of liquid are gone. That's not to say I don't get tipsy, but just on other means.
The World's End.